Howdy ho, friends and foes, and welcome to Dads on Life, your weekly episodic show on parenting on a male perspective. I'm your host, Jay Miles, and with me, as always, are my co-host Keith Bogan,
Greetings from hell.
Chad Holloway,
Good morning.
and Dave Dusenberry.
How's it going, guys?
Doug is on assignment, lost in his house somewhere. I don't know what the hell he's doing. Keith kind of brought up this topic, so I'm going to let him actually introduce it. Keith, floor is yours.
I think it'd be easier if I had that video to put on the screen, but I'll sort of put it into words best I can. And it's going to sound strange coming from me because I'm generally known as a left of center, very progressive individual, but I've sort of been struggling with this myself. A couple of years ago, a good friend of mine who will remain unnamed, who was in charge of youth activities that I'm closely aligned with, used to joke that he had to make allowances for various kids. You know, it used to be boys would sleep on one side of the area that we would go camping it, and girls would sleep at the other side. And then it became a variety of different things. You know, he had to make allowances for people who did not identify that way. And his joke was, I don't care if they identify as a chair. I'll take care of them. I'll make sure that they're, respected and they have their own space. And then the concept of joking that they might identify as a chair became an insult. But to go beyond that, and again, I'm going to struggle to put this into words the right way, is at what point do the political question would have been, at what point do we draw a line in terms of what you can identify as? Literally, a chair sounds ridiculous, but are people actually doing things like that? And the reason I brought it to this group is sort of the differences in how we look at it versus the way our children are looking at it. I know that, like I said, I consider myself left of center. I consider myself very progressive. And yet in the eyes of my sons, I'm Attila the Hun. And, they literally referred to me, and please, Chad, don't be insulted by this. They've called me a Republican, which in my household is an insult. And they refer to President Biden as a Republican, and because they align with lines of thinking that are much further to the left, and something that maybe we would refer to as radical. So back to the subject I'm talking about, and we could get into all the woke stuff, which I think is crap, but people are identifying more and more as different things, and giving them access to different things by doing so. And is there a line to that? And how do we have that conversation with our kids who are, every younger generation is more liberal. As people get older, they tend to get a bit more conservative, or a lot more conservative, depending on their bent. So it's a tough conversation. I can imagine it was a tough conversation with my parents to talk about real music is Billy Joel when they're listening to WQX or classic opera. It sounds like a ridiculous comparison, but it's actually almost the same topic.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm going, is even I, as a progressive, am struggling with the amount of things that people are identifying as, how do I have that conversation with my kids? I'm actually afraid to do so.
Well, let's mention where the video goes, and we'll use that as a point of is when you may get too far. The video mentions people who consider themselves transable. What do I mean? You cut your leg off because you feel like you're an amputee. That's one of the things that's discussed in the video.
Which is a really diagnosable condition, yes.
Yep.
Well, yes. And to me, there's a disability there, but it's not the one you're trying to create, of cutting off a body part. There's another kind of disability there. It's called mental illness. So
Well, you started that sentence with those two words that make every argument fail. To me. And that's the challenge is how do we get there? Because to me is going to be different for almost every single person. It's different for people in this room. It would clearly be different if I was to go home and have this conversation with Justin and Jeremy, which I'm afraid to do it because I think that particularly Justin would punch me out. I mean, not literally, but he'd get angry and leave the room because I'm not more understanding, I'm not more inclusive.
So you're condoning cutting your arm off to be transable then.
See,
I'm not condoning it. I'm recognizing it as a diagnosable psychological condition.
Right. That's what I'm arguing. It's a psychological condition. It's mental illness. It's the same thing as somebody's a cutter. It's the same shit.
so I would say my general thought on this, right? So first of all, when it comes to mental illness and I don't really put much of a difference between mental illness and physical disabilities. They both inhibit and hamper the ability of the sufferer or person to be able to function as a full and productive member of society in whatever capacity, right? So
Exactly.
whether it's mental illness or physical disability, to me, they both have things that are required to be treated. I don't consider one any more major than the other, right?
Sure.
So when it comes to this particular affliction, to go with what Keith says, it's absolutely a thing. There's body dysmorphia. People get affected and look at their own limbs as if they're dying or as if they're dead and just hanging on there. And all they think about and obsess over is just getting rid of it. To them, the limb is dead, gone. Just it's like a cancerous growth that needs to be gotten rid of. And it's totally psychologically driven. Physically it's not there, but the brain is a weird thing, dude. The brain gets wired it's wired and functions in a way that none of us understand, even after studying it for years and years and years and years. And sometimes things can go haywire, right? So when it comes to identity questions, I suppose, my older son was dating for a while a lovely person that considered themselves that didn't identify as either male or female and preferred the pronoun they. Now, I know we've talked about this before, right? So it's funny because when I became aware of this, my son let me know, I simply incorporated the pronoun they whenever I refer to them.
Right.
For me, it was no big deal. I don't. It's if that's what you prefer, whatever, that's fine. I actually did a better job of using the pronoun they than he did, which is hilarious.
That is kind of funny.
So for me, when it comes to identity questions, I tend to, and this kind of goes to Keith's point about, when you use the words for me, now your argument becomes subjective. And all of the stuff that we're talking about here tends to be subjective. There's really no objective argument that we can make about this stuff because there's a lot of factors that go into this, like how and why somebody takes this path in terms of self-identification, which you're not doing it because it's easier. As soon as you go down this path of self-identification as something outside of the norm, that is highly discomfortable, or uncomfortable, that could be judged big time. So to me, nobody goes out of their way to do that on purpose without a good, solid core reasoning as to why, right? So I tend to take the path of, I like to sit down with said person if I can and ask questions and find out why and find out what the core reasoning is behind this.
Right.
And based on that, you can make a call on, is this legitimate or not? Look, it's not uncommon to say that sometimes the stuff is done for attention. That is one very, very reasonable possibility for taking this course of action. And there are others that it's completely legit. One of my good friends is trans and is really only the surgery short of just completing their journey, right?
Yeah.
Was female, now considered male. He goes by the name of Jim. Cool dude. If you looked at him, you would not see female at all.
Yeah.
Because that's how he presents himself. Full beard, everything looks great. And he's put a lot of time and effort and done the testosterone treatments and everything like that to get to that point. Now, to me, that whatever decision you made, clearly he's bought into it, right? So I would never refer to Jim as shit, even though biologically, that's what he is. But that to me, that's legit. So any of these identity things, I don't know. I prefer to take it individually and look at them as individual cases and see if I can find out core reasoning why. For me,
Dave, I don't know if you were here. I think you were. I'm not sure. Were you here for the show we did on Mac Bags? The wrestler in Texas?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
yes, I was.
We did this. We covered as it comes to sports, and we discussed a similar exact example of that. What you just described about your friend. We talked about that. If for anybody who wasn't paying attention or didn't see it, Mac Beggs was a wrestler in Texas who wanted to wrestle the boys as he trans from girl to boy. But the state of Texas said, nope, you got to wrestle as a girl. And he dominantly won 2 state championships. Technically, for all intent and purposes, is a boy.
Yeah.
I think maybe I still don't know if he's had everything completely done, but that's not the point. The point is he was forced to do something that he didn't want to do. And hopefully, I don't think in a state like Texas they will, hopefully laws like that or ideas like that will change in this country. Now I'll get to I shouldn't, but I'll discuss something that's been going on in my world for now 2 weeks. It actually started in January. Well, actually really started in 2021, but in 2021 in AA, they changed the wording of the preamble, which for years, like 80, 70, was a fellowship of men and women. They changed the wording officially through AAWS, AA World Services, to people from men and women. In a program of inclusion, where the only requirement is the desire to stop drinking, which is third tradition, short from a third tradition. It caused it was decided by World Services that they were going to change it, and our home group voted 20-9 in January to keep the wording of people. Mm-hmm. Well, for the better part of 2 weeks, I've been dealing with one person who I've been on the phone with twice, including once on Friday, after telling him last week that it's not going to change. Had a conversation with him about it, and then within 10 minutes of the beginning of our business meeting yesterday, his hand went up, and of course, changing it back to men and women came out of his mouth again. We decided this in January. Well, not everybody knew. Well, they knew about the business meeting for over a month. And the list of what we were going to talk about was out there every week for everybody to look at. So don't tell me they didn't know, because they did. Mm-hmm. We didn't hide this. So one of my arguments is we're a program of inclusion. We can't, kick anybody out or keep anybody from joining a group. They're actually, and what's interesting is I had only heard about a person who is trans in one of the local area groups. Well, I met this person for the first time in October and immediately saw, what everybody kind of.
The connection issue? He's working on getting back. Connection was kind of choppy when he first signed on. So
I'm on my own hotspot. I don't understand this. I can't even see you guys now.
yeah, all we can see is your name
Keith
tag.
Bogan logo.
I
Oh,
can't.
there we go. So we're back.
I don't understand.
Alright.
It doesn't make sense. My hotspot should be fine here. And of course,
Okay.
well, the recording's continuing, I guess. I don't know if it's the same one.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, good.
We're back.
So anyway, there's somebody in a local group, she goes by Tina, who it's actually the opposite. But it's kind of obvious that she's still transitioning.
Yeah.
So, and identifies as a woman, which were they? I don't know exactly what she uses. I'm not 100% sure, but another interesting conversation we had with the guy who I had the conversation with, his sponsee. We had a conversation, and he kept saying he, referring to him as Timmy. And our counselor and I both, every time he'd say it, we'd say she. So I mean, I get it, I do, but it's still, it's in that aspect, it's an argument over 4 words, and I understand it, and I understand the redundancy of a fellowship of people. Fellowship is a people. It's do you know anything about the program? What a fellowship is a group of people. So it's a people of people, essentially. But it's kind of, and then his big argument was, well, what's next? Did they start taking God out of it? It's the argument was a little bit ridiculous of what he was trying to say. And one of the things he brought up was the men with the men and the women with the women. I looked at him, I said, if it wasn't for the women in this home group, I'm not sober.
Yeah.
So
Yep. You know,
It-
there's you know, there's a lot in that, right? So I'm seeing a couple of themes kind of come together, right? Number one, Keith mentioned how, and it's true, how as we get older, people tend to be seen or feel more conservative. And B, change is hard, and C, younger generations want to establish a different, really a different reality than generations behind them. So all 3 of these kind of come together on what you're talking about, Jeff. All 3 of them. So we have an organization that's been around for a long time that is based on inclusion, right? AA,
Mhm. Basically
absolutely
100
agree,
years almost.
right? And for all of that time, the wording of their preamble worked just fine to include all of those that sought the services of this program.
Right.
Things have changed recently. You know, the idea of being trans, or the idea of being outside of the gender norm for a very, very long time was something that was kept hush hush in the closet, out of the spotlight. We didn't talk about it.
Mhm.
Right? That's a given. These newer, you know, our generation, Gen X, some of that stuff started to change. You know, I mean, God, you look at an example like Boy George from Culture Club. You know, not for nothing. I mean, you know, you didn't see an artist like that. You know, maybe you saw some glam rock stuff in like the 70s and things like that of people
Say Alice
dressing
Cooper.
like that. Yeah, but not in the same way. His was done more to shock. I mean, you could probably look more at like the New York Dolls than you could at Alice Cooper.
That's
right?
true. That's true. Good point.
So, you know, you know, that's a big change in the last 30, 40 years, right? Over what was done the prior 150 or so. And this generation now is going even more towards allowing that, because they're recognizing that people inside, sometimes they don't fit in the binary bag. They want to express who and what they are. And they don't feel that there should be a problem with that. And older generations, as we've seen, change is really freaking hard. And for folks that are in a program like AA, where you want to be you've been in this life of, you know, things out, you're discovering that now everything's out of your control, and
Right.
holy fucking shit, this sucks, right?
Right.
So you're trying to reach and embrace for something that you can anchor yourself to control, to ground you, so that you can recover and move forward. And this is introducing a change into a core program that people are putting a lot of their beliefs in, and they're kind of freaking out about it. Now, I'm with you. I'm totally fine with it. I see no problem with it. I agree that the whole point of it is a program of inclusion, and
Right.
sometimes people fall out of that fact, right? But what I'm saying is it's a great example of, you know, yes, we're moving. Yes, yes, younger generations are being more progressive, and they're doing more of this stuff, and
Mhm.
older generations are freaking out because
Sure.
it's not the same as what we're comfortable with, and things are changing, and now that's threatening our reality and our core. There's a lot involved in that. That was a really, really, really good point.
Well, going back, you brought up Boy George. Um, and in a kind of opposite manner, you had in the same time period, you had, and there absolutely was anything about her. She was straight. She was just looked different. Was Annie Lennox when she was in the Eurythmics, and up until pretty much probably the mid '90s, she wore literally wore suits. So that kind of was brought into question as well.
Yeah.
And had a little bit of an androgynous look to her, but in reality, it was legitimately just a show. She's married to a man and everything normal. It was just a look. So
I'll throw Grace Jones in there too. You
We
want to
can
talk about an androgynous look?
we
That girl was fucking fierce.
we can probably and we should one day go down this rabbit hole and go into pop culture type stuff with this. And actually, we probably maybe even next week we'll do that, because we can go. You and I probably can go on for like 3 hours on that.
So I'd like to jump in for a second here. There's two things I want to say. And I didn't mean to cut you off, but I'm just having trouble getting in before.
No.
One is everything we have said for the last 15 minutes is what my kids get angry about, because the younger generation, much like we did, they look at us like, how could you not understand this? How could you not automatically accept this? Because that's the world they grew up in, and they do not have a tolerance for the learning curve. They do not have a tolerance to understand that we want to understand and be accepting, but it takes time to adjust to what we were taught, whether it was right or wrong. And my sons in particular get angry about that because they do not get that there should ever have been a learning curve, that we're evil because of it. The other thing I want to say is, by the way, is Chad still on here? Hi, Chad.
Yes.
You gonna talk?
I'm actually very interested, Chad, to hear.
Yes, I'm waiting.
Right?
Come on, give me some thoughts.
Well, here's my 2 cents on this. Is that, and I think you guys have heard my stories when I'm back in the early '90s. I told you guys the story of having trans people in my class, pre-op, post-op, cross-dressers as well, and discussing that in the class, right? So, and as I said in my text to you guys, it was before it was fashionable. I also at the same time was doing a lot of HIV and AIDS research, going into the gay community, doing surveys, those kinds of things, trying to help stop that. That was when they were still a very outside group. So that's some of the things I want to say. Is like, I was early on in those. I was a little younger. But I will tell you, some of the stuff nowadays where we talk about people identifying as other things, that, for me, I'm with Jason on it. There's a psychological or psychiatric component to that. I mean, if I look back 30 years ago, there was a young woman who identified as my daughter. And she's like, "Oh, you're my dad. Can I have your keys?" And I said, "No, I'm not your dad, and you can't have my keys." We were in a lockdown psychiatric unit. She was a schizophrenic. So that's kind of where I fall. I mean, it's way beyond where you guys are. So it's a whole different direction. But for me, I get some of it, but some of the stuff where people are saying there are things that aren't scientific. I mean, because here's the thing, like, I think the four of us would agree that on science, right? Science is a thing. But what I think's being created now is fantasy in many cases. Oh, I identify as a chair. You're not a chair, dude. I'm going to cut off my arm because I feel disabled. Well, you don't cut off your arm. So that's my 2 cents on that. There's this difference, because I'm really based in science. you know, and just because I think I'm something else doesn't mean I am. I mean, I could, you know, I could say I'm a coffee cup, but hey, you guys can look at me and and you guys would say, hey, Chad, you're not a coffee cup. Or the other side of it is maybe go, oh, you're a great coffee cup. I would love to drink coffee out of you. So, I mean,
I'll drink to that.
I'm never drinking out of Chad. That's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
why are you discriminating against me? Be more inclusive, Keith. Come on.
No, but you know what? That's a good point. Like, but as I said, you know, and there are cases of people doing it for attention, and maybe it's kind of not proper to say that, but it is a actual distinct psychological possibility. So, well, you know, for those that are doing, and you mentioned the case of the one who identified as your daughter, you said she was schizophrenic. So there's core reasoning there. Something wired is broken, and that requires therapy and treatment to address and resolve the core driver of what's going on, of why that person is thinking the way they are and taking the course the way that they're taking. And this is where science and psychology kind of get a little scrambled, because science says you're wired this way, and psychology can say, well, that wiring is coming in, but I'm kind of like, it's not grounded properly, so it's not necessarily going out the way that you think it should.
Ooh, I really want to jump in on that. I really want to jump in on that because
Go.
30 to 50 years ago, we were saying we, society, not me, society was saying the exact same thing to people who wanted to sleep with the same gender.
Yeah.
So our sons and daughters' arguments are going to be 30 to 50 years ago, you were saying the same bullshit about a man and a woman actually not, you know, being with the same gender. Why are you against what we're talking about now when you were against something so stupid back then? 30 years from now, we could easily look at it as, you know, maybe science shows us that, well, maybe you can identify as Black even though you're white. Maybe you can identify as disabled even though you're not. Maybe there's a whole scientific reasoning behind it, and it becomes a totally accepted thing. So back to the concept of how do you have this conversation with the kids, because they can easily throw it in our faces that our generation, the one we grew up in, actually didn't even think that it was, you know, it was psychologically disturbed for a man to sleep with a man or a woman to sleep with a woman.
And you know what? That's accurate. That's true. That is a true statement. And that's hard for us to hear. But the way I look at it is things like this, there are those that suffer from these where these truths are innate because it's a core part of who and what they are, right? But it takes a while for those that don't have that as part of their core being to really come to terms and be able to understand what that is. And in order to get there has to be talkings and studies, and there has to be a mutual level of understanding, and that takes a while. That requires patience and work. So, you know, we go back to, you know, some truths are self-evident, you know, well, some truths are self-evident, some aren't. Some take a while to learn and understand and embrace, because it's not what reality was when we were raised and when we were founded. So if it's a learned skill, it takes a while to figure out and be able to work on. As to your point, Keith, with Jeremy and Justin, they're going to have, as they get older, you know, this stuff happens every single time a generation changes, right? To go back to your point about why is opera not real music and what the hell is this Billy Joel devilish crap, you know? Look, it happens, you know, new understandings and new discoveries are made every generation. And so we are now in the place where we are transitioning from our knowledge of what reality is to what our kids' knowledge of what reality is, and it's different. And now they're like, well, this has always been the case. One of my former relationships, this brings up a great point about different generations, right? So someone I was involved with for a long time, the big delineation in our realities was Rob Halford of Judas Priest. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, Rob Halford, fronted the metal band Judas Priest, classic image of metal, right? Leather, freaking hard rock dude, like just awesome. And for my partner at the time, she was like, "What do you mean you didn't know Rob Halford was gay?" That was a huge shock when he came out.
Really?
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
That was a huge shock when he came out in the metal community, which I was an avid part of. People were like, "Holy crap, really?" And then for my ex, she was like, "How did you not know that he was gay?" Like, of course he's gay, but like it just goes to show that one side assumes it, and the other side was shocked by it, and that happens every generation. It's going on now.
Well, well, I can speak on that exact example of gay lesbian, and I'll get into that the lesbian part of it a little more in a second, and how my kids are affected. Excuse me. My dad, his cousin passed away quite a while ago. I remember one of the first time, I don't know, maybe 7, 8, something like that. I was introduced to him. I was like, oh, the mannerisms, everything was there. Maybe I didn't know the word for it, but I knew he was different, obviously. And then within a year or two, my father was telling me stories about him and his boyfriend and all this stuff. And I was like, okay. And it just was, I kind of, like I said, the seeds were sown the minute I met him. And it was just now absolutely remarkable man. He was the piano player for a group called the Harmonic Cats at one point. He owned a dance studio in New York. He was a fantastic dancer when he was younger. He actually, my father would tell me he's the one who taught my father's class to do the can-can. They had to do the can-can dance for something, and he's the one that taught it to them. Like just when it comes to the arts, Alan's son was all over a lot of the stuff in the probably 70s in New York. And it just, like I said, when I found out or figured out that he was gay, it was kind of like, okay, whatever, no surprise at all. Because like I said, I knew stories because when my father's referring to somebody called Frank, it's obvious that it's a man. There's no inkling that it's a woman to me when you say Frank. Not even, in the early 90s, even if you said Frankie, maybe I would think, okay, it was a girl, but not likely. Still, Frankie. Then, which is funny, later on, within the last year, I had a really good friend growing up. His name was Frank. They called him Frankie, and there was a reference to a little girl named Frankie in my with Sadie, and I didn't put two and two together and realize that when she was talking about Frankie, she was talking about my friend's daughter, Francesca. So it was like, oh, when it, like, my head snaps when they say Frankie, because I still think they're talking about their father, but obviously now I know it could be either one of them. Or if it's Sadie, they reference that she's referencing Francesca. But anyway, with Sadie and Delana, what they know is transgender is something that's out there in their life. My wife's best friend is trans or transing. Born a girl, removed her breast a few years ago. It goes by I don't think she'll ever completely trans into a boy. Goes by Logan, but it's Logan, Logann, so she goes by that. It slips sometimes, usually between my wife and I, but the girls will occasionally slip and call her Lori. but never, it's thankfully never really happened to her face. But to their face. So and she was a lesbian. So it's been in, in their wheelhouse their entire lives, really. So for them, maybe to have an example like that, for all of us to have an example like that, makes it, dealing with it in the real world, so to speak, easier. Even for me, even for Elise. Elise and I weren't really surprised when we heard that it was coming. At first, I kind of thought it was for attention. Then I heard about the surgery and was like, okay, this is really what she wants. Good. But to say, this is a person who had some mental health issues in her life. To see the difference in them now, to 3 or 4 years ago, it's not the same person. And I don't mean that in the way you guys think.
Would you say that the mental health issues have radically cleared up?
That's exactly what I'm getting at.
Then would it
She
be fair
is
to say, then it would be fair to say they were never mental health issues at all? And that's
You
what
could
my kids
make
are
that
talking about.
You could make that argument.
That's
could definitely
exactly
make
what
that
my kids are talking about. And they get angry when we automatically assume that someone is that's, as we categorize, because we have this need to categorize people. We put them in the trans category or the whatever category. And well, it started with mental issues, but really was it psychological issues? No, it was that they had a
She absolutely had the psychological, she had the psychological issues. And I'm sure there still are some, but it's radically different.
But she
now.
would argue that she didn't have the psychological issues, that society did. And that she was fine all along. She was just trapped inside the box that we were trying to put her in.
No. She would never argue that. She would
Many,
never argue that. She would
many
openly,
would in that situation.
as it comes to the mental issues of transing, no, she would. You're right, but she would never argue she's not had mental issues in her past because she's been committed. She openly admits she's had issues. She also had, surprise, had issues with anorexia and things like that as well. So,
and many would argue that those are all a result of the immense pressure she felt from society's judgment of her behavior and her preferences, and that was her way of hiding from all of that shit. But
there's always
but that was no. You're talking not really, because it was all yes, but this was also, we're not talking that part. We're not talking recently. That part predates my relationship with my wife. So,
but I think you're missing the whole point. Someone like that, there's no predating. They had a certain disposition in them all along. They may not have started showing signs that they had preferred one gender over another until maybe they were in their 20s. But from the time they were little, there was something going on that was confusing them that they didn't know how to react to. And because they were confused, they probably acted in a certain way that got them ostracized by their peers. And it results in things like anorexia.
There's a connotation of heredity. Her mother shows a lot of some of the similar mental health issues that she had growing up. So there's heredity
there. Had gender issues too, and didn't know.
No, but no. Well, that would be probably the tough conversation with a woman who's 70.
Yeah.
and
Sure.
still married to her.
It doesn't rule out the possibility that was in fact what was going on. If
Maybe,
you want
but
to trace it,
but-
if you're going to trace it, most of the people that we categorize as having mental challenges, mental difficulties, psychological challenges, in fact, are probably people who have a different vision of themselves than the rest of society does. And
Yep.
they're struggling with it because society refuses to let them out of the box they put them in.
I just so in our group chat, just if you want to take a look at it, it's an article that popped up recently, right? It talks about a lawmaker named Karen Berg down in Kentucky. Now, in Kentucky, there's a lot of laws working on being passed that are not necessarily friendly to transgender folk, right? They're working on trying to legally establish things that aren't necessarily friendly to those that fall outside of the gender norms. Kentucky's a very conservative state. It's something that I guess a lot of the people are pushing for. This lady named Karen Berg just lost her son to suicide at age 24. Her son came out as trans when he was 16 and had a speech in front of the Congress at the time talking about struggles about it and identity and how the judgment from society really affected his struggle. And here we are 7 years later and it took his life, right? So she's taking her son's story and trying to use it to try to get her fellow lawmakers to care about this stuff. Because when there's ignorance on a topic, it makes it easier to vote against. But you don't, as soon, to kind of go back to your guys' points, as soon as you have a personal stake, as soon as you know something personally that's dealing with this, it changes your whole perspective on it. Because if it's not a known quantity in your personal life, this is the subjective part of it. To go back to how change the way you see it and the way you want others to see it, right? Keith, like you were talking about with your boys, this is the way it's always.